Hey guys, what is up? It is me, JMA Granny, debut author of a teen drama mystery sci-fi thriller that is going to be released at some point this year, although hoping for September of 2022. Do you like my content? If so, click the subscribe button. Today, I am going to be reading through a short story from this book called Voices Under the Sky. This book is actually full of collections from indigenous artists and authors of fiction and nonfiction and pieces of poetry. And I actually read a short story from here a little while back, actually quite a while back. It is a Cree-based legend. I can't wait for you guys to look at it. And this book is just full of like so many short stories. Like I like this one. I've read quite a few of them already. And this short story called A Mountain Legend by Jordon Wheeler, it really touched me because I'm always looking for legends. I'm always looking for new short stories to read. And I really connected this because, as we all know, I myself am First Nation. So, without any further ado, let us get started. The school bus drove into a small summer camp at the base of a towering mountain. Boys and girls between the ages of 8 and 12 who had signed up for the 3-day camping trip poured out of the bus. Following instructions from the counselors, they began hurriedly preparing their camp as the sunset dripped over the rock walls towering above them. For many, it was the first time away from the city, which they could still see far off in the distance. Tents were put up and sleeping bags and rolled before the last of the twilight rays gave way to the darkness of night. Roasting marshmallows around a large campfire, the young campers listened intently to stories told by the counselors. Behind the eager campers, the caretaker of the camp sat at the ground, himself listening in to the stories. As the night grew old, the younger children rarely found their way to their tents, so that by midnight the only 12-year-olds remained around the fire with one counselor and the caretaker. Their supply of stories seemingly exhausted, they sat in silence watching the glowing embers of the once fiery blaze shrink into red-hot ash. "The moon is rising," announced the caretaker in a low, even voice. All eyes looked up to the glowing surrounding the jagged peaks of the mountains. The blackness of the rock forms an eerie silhouette against the gently lit sky. The caretaker's name was McNabb. He had lived close to the mountain all his life and knew many of the stories the mountain had seen. He threw his long black braided hair over his shoulders, drew the collar of his faded jean jacket up against the crisp mountain air, and spoke. "There is a legend about this mountain, once told by the mountain itself," he said. Paused for a moment, then continued. "People claim that long ago it told of a young boy who tried to climb up to an eagle's nest which rested somewhere among the many cliffs. He was from a small camp about a day's journey from here, and when he was 12 years old, he thought he was ready to become a warrior. His father disagreed, saying he was way too young and too small. But the boy was stubborn, and one morning before dawn he sneaked out of his family's teepee and set off on foot toward the mountain. There were no horses in North America in his time. They were brought later by the Europeans. It took most of the day for him to reach the mountain. The next morning he set out to find an eagle and seek vision from the mighty bird, as that was the first step in becoming a warrior. But as he was climbing up the rock cliffs to a nest, he fell to his death, releasing a terrible cry that echoed from the mountain far out across the land. The legend says the boy's spirit still wanders the mountain today." A coyote howled in the distance, and the campers jumped. "Is it true?" asked one of the boys, with worry and fear in his voice. "Some people say so. And they also say you could still hear his scream every once in a while." All around the dying fire, eyes were straining up at the menacing rock peaks. The caretaker, McNabb, however, wasn't looking at the mountain. He was watching one of the young campers. He was an Indian boy, smaller than the others, with short, braided hair that fell down to his back. The boy was gazing up at the mountain, his curiosity obviously blended with fear. Turning his head, his eyes met those of McNabb. For a fleeting moment, they locked stares. Then McNabb relaxed, a knowing expression spreading over his face, while the boy continued to stare at him, wide-eyed and nervous. There were small discussions around the fire, debating the story's truth before the counselor told them it was time for sleep. Both tired and excited, they retreated to their tent and crawled into their sleeping bags. The boy Jason lay in a tent he shared with two other boys, who lay talking in the dark. As Jason waited for the heat of his body to warm his sleeping bag, he thought of that long-ago boy. He felt a closeness to him and imagined himself in his place. "Hey, Jason, why don't you climb up that mountain tomorrow morning and try to catch an eagle?" It was Ralph, who was against the far wall of the tent on the other side of Barry. "Why?" asked Jason. "You're Indian, aren't you? Don't you want to become a warrior?" True, Jason was Indian, but he knew nothing of becoming a warrior. He had spent all his life in the city. All he knew of his heritage was what his grandmother told him from time to time, which wasn't much. He had been to 3 powwows in his life at a large hall not far from his house, but he never learned very much. His time was spent eating hot dogs, drinking pop, and watching the older boys play pool in the adjoining rooms. As little as he knew, though, he wanted Ralph and Barry to think he knew a lot. "No, it's not time for me to be a warrior yet," he told them. "Why not?" asked Barry. "It just isn't, that's all," Jason said, not knowing a better answer. "You're a chicken. You couldn't climb that mountain if you tried," Ralph charged. "I'm not chicken. I could climb that mountain, no problem. It just isn't time yet." "You're a chicken," Ralph said again. "Go to sleep," boomed a voice across the campground. Ralph gave out 3 chicken clucks and rolled over to sleep. Jay lay there in mild anger. He hated being called a chicken, and if the counselor hadn't shouted at that moment, he would have given Ralph a swift punch. But Ralph was right. The mountain did scare him. With his anger subsiding, he drifted into a haunting sleep, filled with dreams. Dreams the wind swept through the camp, gently spreading the mountain spirit's stories throughout. A coyote's piercing howl echoed from the rocky cliffs, making Jason flinch in his sleep. The following morning, Ralph, Barry, and Jason were the first ones up. As they emerged from the tent to the chilled morning air, their attention was immediately grasped by the huge rock peaks looming high above. Ralph's searching eyes panned the mountain. A large blanket of mist enveloped its lower reaches. Pointing up, he said, "See that ledge up there?" Jason and Barry followed Ralph's arm to a cliff among one of the rock walls just above the tree line. "I bet you can't get to it," he dared Jason. "I could so," Jason responded. "Prove it," Ralph said. Jason was trapped, and he knew it. If he said no, he could be admitting he was scared. And there was another challenge in Ralph's voice, unsaid. But Jason heard it. Ralph was daring him to prove himself an Indian. Jason had lived his whole life in a city on cement ground and among concrete mountains where climbing was as easy as walking upstairs or pressing an elevator button. To prove Ralph and himself that he was Indian, Jason had to climb that ledge. He knew that mountain climbing could end a life, and there were wild animals he might have to deal with. How was he supposed to react? How would he react? He was afraid. He didn't want to go. But if he didn't? "What's the matter?" Ralph taunted. "Scared?" At that point, Jason decided he would face the mountain and reach that ledge. "Okay," he conceded. At first, the climbing was easy, but his progress became slow and clumsy as he got higher. Struggling over the uneven and thorough trees, he came across a large flat rock. In need of a rest, he sat down and looked down at the campground he had left right after breakfast an hour ago. He could see the bodies scurrying about. If they hadn't noticed by now that he was missing, he thought. No doubt they would soon. Looking up, he could just see the ledge above the tree line. It wasn't much further, he thought. He could get to it, wave down at the camp to show he made it, and be back in time for lunch. Raising himself up, he started to climb again, marching through the trees and up the steep slope, over the rough terrain. A few moments later, he heard a loud howl that seemed to come from somewhere. above. At first, he thought it was a coyote, but it sounded like a human. Nervously, he kept going. In the camp, Ralph and Barry were getting ready to help prepare lunch. McNabb was starting a fire not far away. They, too, heard the howl. "I never knew coyotes did that during the day," Ralph said to Barry. Overhearing, McNabb responded, "That was no coyote." A half hour later, Jason stood just above the tree line, the ledge. His goal was 10 meters up, but what lay ahead was treacherous climbing, nearly straight up the rock wall. He scrutinized the rock face, planning his route, and began to pick his way up the last stretch. The mountain saw the boy encroaching and whispered a warning to the wind, sweeping strongly down its face, and it remembered a similar event long ago. Jason felt the wind grow stronger, driving high-pitched sound into his ears. Gripping the rock harder than he pulled himself up a bit at a time. The wind seemed to be pushing him back, but he felt something else too, something urging him on. When he was about 7 meters up the rock face, with his feet firmly on a small ledge, he chanced to look down between his legs. He could see that if he slipped, he would plummet right straight down to those 7 meters, and after hitting the rocks below, he would tumble a great distance further. He knew it would spell death, and for a split second he considered going back down. But once again he felt an outside force pushing him to go on. It gave him comfort and courage. His face reddened, his heart pounded, and the beads of sweat poured from him as he inched his way higher. Straight above, an eagle flew in great circles, slowly moving closer to Jason and the ledge. Far down the mountain, in search for Jason was well underway, but the counselors had no way of knowing where he was, as Ralph and Barry hadn't told. McNabb also knew where Jason was, but he too remained silent. An 8-year-old girl in the camp lay quietly in her tent, staring up through the screen window at the sky. The search for Jason had been tiring, and she had come back for rest. She was watching a cloud slowly change shape, and a large black bird flew by high above. Out of curiosity, she unzipped the tent door and went outside to get a better look. She watched the bird fly in smaller and smaller circles, getting closer and closer to the mountain. She took her eyes off the bird for a moment to look at the huge rock, and there, high above the trees, only a meter or so below a ledge, she saw the boy climbing. Right away, she knew the boy was in danger. After hesitating for a moment, she ran to tell a counselor. Jason paused from climbing, just a few meters below the edge. He was exhausted, and the insides of his hands were raw, the skin having been scraped off by the rough rock. The ledge was so close. He pulled himself up to it, placing his feet inside a crack in the rock for support. Reaching over the ledge, he swept one arm along the ledge, found another spot for his feet, hoisting his body up, rolled onto the ledge, and got to his feet. There, an arm's length away on the ledge, were 2 young eagles in a large nest. For several minutes he just remained there, looking at the baby eagles. He had never seen an eagle's nest before. He was so interested in the 2 young eagles he didn't notice the mother eagle circling high overhead, nor did he hear her swoop down towards him and her nest. She landed in front of him, spread her wings, and let out a loud screech. Jason was so terrified he instinctively jumped, and in doing so lost his balance. Both feet stepped out into the air as he grabbed onto the rock. His hands clung desperately to the edge as the sharp rock dug into his skin. He looked down and saw his feet dangling in the air. The wind swung him, making it impossible to get his feet back on the rock where they had been moments earlier. A coyote howled, and Jason's terror grew. Again he looked down at the rocks below, tears streaming down his face. He didn't want to die. He wished he had never accepted Ralph's dare. He could picture them coming up the mountain, finding his dead body among the rocks, crying over him. He began crying out loud and heard it echoing off the rock, or he thought it was an echo. He stopped and listened. There was more crying, but not from him. Again he felt the presence of something or someone else. The wind swirled in and whispered to Jason the mountain's legend. Though running swiftly, the young boy Muskawashi had paced himself exertly for the day's journey. He would arrive at the base of the mountain a far earlier than he had expected, and would have plenty of daylight left to reach his supper and find a spot for a good night's sleep. Though small, and having only seen 12 summers, his young body was strong. He would be able to reach the mountain in only 2 runs, pausing in between to catch a rabbit for lunch. As his powerful legs moved him gracefully across the prairie, he thought back to the conversation with his father the day before. He had explained how most of his friends were already in preparation for manhood, and he felt he was ready too. He did not want to wait for the next summer. When some of his friends came back later that day from a successful buffalo hunt, he decided he would go to the mountain alone and seek a vision from the eagle. He knew he would have to rise before the sun to get out of the camp without being seen. When he reached the base of the mountain, the sun was well above the horizon. He sat down in a sheltered area for a rest. He decided this was where he would sleep for the night. After a few minutes, he got up, made himself a trap for a rabbit, and planted it. After laying the trap, he wandered off to look for some berries to eat while preparing his mind for the following day when he would climb the mountain. After some time, he returned to his trap and found a rabbit in it. He skinned it with a well-sharpened stone knife he had brought with him, and built a fire to cook his meal. He would keep the fire burning all night and to keep away the wild animals while he slept. Finishing his meal, he thanked the Creator for his food and safe journey, and prayed for good fortune in his quest for a vision. Then he lay down in front of the soft moss and fell asleep to the music of the coyotes' howls and the whispering wind. The next morning he woke to the sun's warming shine. The still smoldering fire added an aroma of burnt wood to the fresh air. He again prayed to the Creator for good fortune for his quest for a vision and for a safe journey up the mountain. When he finished, he looked up high above and saw eagles flying to and from a rock ledge. This would be his goal. Half-hour later, he stood where the trees stopped growing and the bare rock began. His powerful body had laid steadily through the trees, even though he wasn't used to uphill running. Without resting, he continued his climb, knowing he would have to be careful ahead. The mountain would be dangerous, and its spirit could be evil. As he pulled himself up to the face of the rock, he heard the mountain spirit warning him to stay away. Its voice was a whispering wind, which grew stronger and seemed to be trying to push him back. With determination, Muskawashi climbed. High above, the powerful eagle circled its nest. Just over a meter below the ledge, Muskawashi paused. He was dripping with perspiration from fighting the wind and the mountain. Though scared, he would not let fear overcome him. His desire for manhood was stronger. His hands were hurting and covered in blood from the climb, but he reached out again. After several scrabbling attempts, he was able to grab hold of the ledge and pull himself onto the narrow, flat edge. Eye to eye with 2 baby eagles, he stopped. He felt great pride and relief in having reached his goal and stood there savoring those feelings. He couldn't hear the approach of the mother eagle. As she landed on the ledge in front of him, she let out a loud screech and spread her wings wide. Muskawashi was startled, stepped back, and lost his footing. A gust of wind shoved him further, and he could feel his body in the air as he tried to get a foot back onto the rock. He grabbed the ledge, but his arms were trembling and he could not pull himself back up. His fingers ached and began slipping from the edge. Knowing he would fall soon, he began whimpering. He looked up into the eyes of the eagle. One day, he thought to himself, he would be back. His fingers let go, and he fell, releasing a loud, terrifying scream that echoed from the mountain, far out across the land, and down through time. McNabb and one of the counselors left the camp when the 8-year-old girl told them what she had seen. Both experienced hikers and mountain climbers. They were able to cover the distance in a third of the time it took Jason. When they heard the scream, they quickened their pace. Minutes later, they reached the edge of the tree line and looked up at the ledge. Jason, who had been hanging there for several minutes, also heard the scream and looked down into the eyes of Muskawashi as he fell. Jason felt the tension in his fingers, but sensed there were greater forces keeping him there. Perhaps the mountain itself was hanging on to him. Whatever it was, Jason remained high above McNabb and the counselor, who were watching from the tree line. The wind died down, and the eagle stepped back, making room for him on the ledge. Jason hoisted a foot back onto the ledge and tried to haul himself onto the shelf. Finally, he saw Musquawashi standing on the ledge, extending a hand out to him. Jason grabbed his hand and Musquawashi pulled. The two boys faced one another, looking into each other's eyes. The descendant gaining pride in being Indian, and the ancestor completing the quest he had begun hundreds of years later. A powerful swirl of wind swept up Musquawashi away, leaving Jason alone for the eagle's nest. Jason reached down and picked up a feather out of the nest. Below him stood the counselor and McNabb. They had witnessed Jason's rescue. "Who is that kid up there?" asked the counselor in disbelief. McNabb smiled and answered, "Musquawashi. He will wander this mountain no more." And then, unraveling a long line of heavy hope, he said, "Come on, let's get Jason down." Yeah, that was the mountain legend. And here is the picture that came with the book as well, with the short story here. That's the mountain legend, and that's the short story for the day. Yeah, that's all I got for you guys for the time being. Hopefully you guys will like this video. If you like this kind of content, hit the like button and ring the little bell if you want to be notified of when I upload. I upload every single Tuesday, and any extra bonus content will be uploaded every other Thursday. That is all I got for you guys today. Stay awesome, stay safe. Don't forget to love yourself, because self-esteem is a real thing.